Today on episode number 577 of the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast, Teaching and Learning When Things Go Wrong in the College Classroom with Jessamyn Neuhaus.
Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential.
Welcome to this episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. I'm Bonnie Stahoviak, and this is the space where we explore the art and science of being more effective at facilitating learning. We also share ways to improve our productivity approaches so we can have more peace in our lives and be even more present for our students. What if moments that go most wrong in our teaching are also the moments with the most potential? Jessamyn Neuhaus joins us to talk about embracing SNAFUs, dismantling super teacher myths, and building agency in ourselves and our students, even when everything feels like it's falling apart. Jessamyn Neuhaus is the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence and professor in the School of Education at Syracuse University. She's the author of Geeky Pedagogy, a guide for intellectuals, introverts, and nerds who want to be effective teachers, and editor of Picture a Professor, Interrupting Biases About Faculty and Increasing Student Learning. Jessamyn Neuhaus, welcome back to Teaching in Higher Ed.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
I love that you start this book with telling me and anyone else who reads it that we're actually normal. Could you please, for anyone who hasn't heard the news today, because I feel like sometimes we need daily, hourly reminders, tell us how normal SNAFUs are.
Well, humans got a human, and human beings make mistakes. We make mistakes as part of learning, and we make mistakes just being in the world. I think that academia generally attracts people with perfectionist tendencies, and then there's also systemic aspects to academia that make a lot of people working in it feel like there is a perfect ideal. I see that discourse reinforced unconsciously and not intentionally in a lot of scholarship of teaching and learning and advice about teaching, college teaching. And so I really wanted to write a book that underscored and emphasized the reality of teaching and learning, that things sometimes go wrong. I'm very fortunate at this point in my career to have something of a platform. I mean, I'm not a megawatt star like James Lang or even you, Bonnie, but I do have some pull and sway and seniority. So when I was thinking about what book was going to come after Picture a Professor, I just thought about what's the book. Geeky Pedagogy was the book I wish I could have read before I started teaching. SNAFU Edu is the book I wish I could have read right at a little before midpoint in my teaching career, when I had racked up enough missteps, mistakes, messes, things that had just gone wrong to, well, I won't say lying awake, obsessing over them, but that was what I was doing. And so the book is really aiming to kind of help people break out of that and reframe what happens when things go wrong. And I'll just add that sometimes there is no positive outcome when something goes wrong. Sometimes things just get messed up because, again, people are human. And so sometimes there's a mistake, there's a misstep, you or your students, and you just have to move on from that. But it's not that there's necessarily a positive, glowing, golden silver lining to that.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess just one more thing I'll add, that SNAFUs and the way I approach it in the book mess up teaching and learning. I really wanted to emphasize in this book, unlike my previous books and a lot of books and articles on teaching and learning, that these are things that we're in it together with students, not affected the same way. Our unique positionality, embodied identities, teaching context, those all make a difference. Same for students. But the snafus that I delve into can interfere with teaching efficacy and with student success and learning.
There's another thing that you write about that I don't want to take it too much beyond what you've written, but I've thought about it so much. And that is this toxic positivity. And it's something that I struggle with a lot, where it almost feels like sometimes we don't have the permission to grieve, or the permission to be angry, or experience these feelings. And certainly, how to navigate that in terms of disclosure and where disclosure is important. So how has toxic positivity been important to you, both in terms of this book, but also, beyond that? Do you feel that tension of just, a certain way we're supposed to feel, and any feelings like the feelings that would seem to be very normal, but actually we're so almost get stifled, I guess, culturally speaking?
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a huge, readily identifiable issue in published scholarship of teaching and learning and advice about teaching. It's more like this undercurrent that can creep in to the discourse. And I think it's actually a sort of uniquely academic, intellectual way that shapes our research and discussions about teaching in particular. Is kind of like the flip side of being so incredibly smart. And we've got these massive brains that we apply to our intellectual passions, our research. And the scholarship of teaching and learning, like that's where its roots are, in that kind of framework, that approach that really is highly intellectual. I mean, that's one of the reasons I loved it, right? I want to live in my big brain. But when it was like when the rubber meets the road in teaching, if you're reading articles, books that again and again and again are talking about, here's what the research says, here's the evidence, here's the science of learning, and you do X, Y, and Z because of this evidence. Like that's our jam. We got evidence, we understand it, we can delve into it, we know the research, we apply it. But teaching happens with other human beings in a very, very difficult set of circumstances. Because even when everything is great, like let's say the whole world is perfect in every way, and every single person in your class is ready and willing to engage, and you're in perfect health and they're in perfect health. And even then, learning would be really hard, because learning how to do stuff is hard. And that, of course, will never happen. There's terrible things happening in the world, people's individual life circumstances. There's always struggles. And so that reality is often missed in some of our discussions about teaching, which very understandably we're leaning into. We want the evidence, we want strategies, we want specific ways of understanding, and in nuanced and detailed ways, what's happening in the brain and what's happening with the learning process. So again, I wouldn't accuse any of my fellow scholars of teaching and learning as full-on toxic positivity, but I would say that inadvertently we have a subtext that teaching is somehow perfectible. Teaching and learning is somehow perfectible, and it will never, ever be perfectible. Because of my positionality, and like I said before, the platform that I do have, I thought it was an important message to underscore and emphasize to anyone who will read my book and listen to my melodious words that no, teaching isn't perfectible. Human beings mess up.
The clip that I show more than any other about teaching is from Mike Wesch, and it's called The Sleeper. And the beginning of it, this part, speaking of toxic positivity, this part makes me mad because he says in the credits it's his first attempt at an animated as an
Oh.
drawn, and I'm thinking, how is this your first time, Mike? You make me so angry. But anyway, he sort of talks about in the beginning, essentially his role as, he doesn't say superhero, but you get a superhero vibe, and how he has all these pixels behind him of these screens, almost just, I don't know if it's superhero or magician, all these things. And then yet someone in there is asleep. That's hence the sleeper. It's a beautiful piece. I will link to it in the show notes for anyone who would like to watch it.
Yeah.
But you've introduced this idea of this super teacher myth to me, and also to teaching in higher ed listeners when you were on the show last. But I think we have to bring it back just in case, because people are always joining to listen to the podcast, for the first time. Tell us about this super teacher myth.
Oh my God.
How dangerous it is, and what we might possibly try to do to resist it.
Don't even get me started on the super teacher myth. Nothing quite grinds my gears as much as this particular representation of teaching and learning. And as I discuss it in the book, that this myth, this impossible ideal, it's bad for educators and it's bad for learners too. And it comes from, some of my background is teaching history, pop culture, and cultural studies. So I'm very interested in the cultural representations of teaching and learning. And for college teaching and learning, almost inevitably, the educator is a professor, usually, not always, but usually a man, and often, not always, a white guy. And on TV, he's usually being consulted by the FBI for crimes they can't figure out, and they need his expertise in criminal pathology to interpret. If there is any representation of teaching, it's almost always lecture. Almost always lecture, usually a big, huge hall, but even small classrooms, the dude is lecturing, but not just lecturing. He's fascinating. The students are riveted. Nobody's sleeping. Nobody's scrolling mindlessly. He's not using notes. He's not stumbling, saying or well. He's just orating. And this is where it hurts learners. And the students are learning just by sitting there, being mesmerized. And applauding at the end. I mean, I ask you, applause. Come on. That ideal is in our heads, no matter how we, above the fray of mainstream representations we may think we are. That cultural discourse around teaching as the best teaching looks this certain way, it feels this certain way, it is immediately transformative. In that representation, there's no like grinding labor where you have to do something over and over and over again to learn how to do it well. That means teaching well or learning a new skill. There's very little representation of the hard work that students need to do. There's no sense that engagement is really collaborative. My new colleague here at Syracuse, Ebony Graham, is my faculty developer specializing in students as partners. And she and I have been working on some stuff for our Course Redesign Institute. We're talking about student engagement. And she pointed out to me, engagement it's not a top-down thing you can impose. Engagement is a collaboration. It's a collaborative effort. But there's nothing like that. The super teacher just magically creates it. In his usually, not always, but his, with this power that he hasn't, you don't see him sitting in a seminar, you don't see him in a workshop, you don't see him reading small teaching, like trying to figure it out. No, he's a bored teacher. He's a genius. He can just do it. That ideal, as ridiculous as it can sound when we parse it out, I mean, it's really stuck in our heads, ours and our students' heads. So it creates obstacles for us.
And speaking of obstacles, one of the obstacles in confronting that myth for ourselves and in more of a collective way is that you're giving us this perspective that rather than thinking about the identity of teachers, our own identities, as overly simplistic of a superhero,
Right.
is to think about the reality of our identities as intersectional.
Mm-hmm.
Would you talk about how integral intersectionality is for
Sure.
understanding both snafus and how we might respond to them?
Sure. The first section of the book is titled Inequity, and it looks at the ways that systemic inequities create obstacles to our success as educators and student success in the classroom and in college. I think one thing I've been harping on for a long time, and I noticed when I got into the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, is that context is so crucial and important. Absolutely not the first person to say that. This is a important field in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. I do think one way I'm pushing it forward and contributing to the conversation is having us really think together, students and faculty, how does inequity interfere with our success? So, for example, stereotypes and assumptions, biases about what academic expertise looks like, quote unquote, what a professor looks like. That creates different kinds of obstacles that faculty have to navigate depending on their embodied identities. Another big one with our context that actually affects the most people teaching in college settings is employment status. What kinds of inequities around employment security, teaching loads, class size, how that creates different, not insurmountable, but creates obstacles to teaching success. And then thinking about our students with the same complexity, what kinds of systemic inequities, in addition to everyone's life circumstances, might be interfering with their ability to learn and succeed, might be snafuing their learning and their success in your class.
It can be so helpful for us to think about that for ourselves. And that's, I mean, part of why earlier when you were talking about this toxic positivity, and I was picturing in my head a recipe where it's just like, oh yeah, you just put all the ingredients in and then out is going to come, you know. And I always like to share the story of, I'm not much of a baker, which you'll tell in just a moment when I share that I was attempting to use some leftover bananas and make blueberry banana bread. And we didn't have any baking. I don't know if it was baking powder or baking soda, whichever one it is that makes it rise. And I was like, well, how important could this ingredient be? It's such a small amount of it. And proceeded to attempt to bake it without the ingredient that would let it rise, coupled with the fact that I took the blueberries and I put them in I mixed them up so that it just become a purple, like we're no longer like anything resembling blueberries. It was an absolute disaster. But so like, first of all, I didn't follow the recipe, right? And then second of all, I didn't really understand the process by which the recipe might be executed. But we add into that these intersectionalities that different chefs, if you will, or bakers, or whatever analogy I want to use, like we're not all able to follow the same recipe.
Oh my gosh, but it's so funny, Bonnie, that you say that, because with that particular analogy, my first book, my first dissertation, my first academic research passion was about cookbooks and gender ideology. What fascinates me about cookbooks and other prescriptive literature is looking, as a historian, looking back at the past, like where did society decide this is the way to do it? This is the important thing. Follow these directions. So I researched like marriage manuals, etiquette guides, classroom mental hygiene films from the 1950s. And so that ongoing curiosity, the thing that made me the scholar first, that's always been in my mind reading Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And it's not as blatant or obvious as like how to go on a date film from 1945, but there is just like you said, there's this kind of set prescription, these sort of guidelines that kind of suggest or at least reinforce for their readers this idea, oh, just do this and this. That's the critique that's been around, something saying like best practices. There's evidence-based, research-based things we can do that often improve teaching and learning. But do they fit perfectly every person every time? No, they do not. You have to be able to adapt your context to what works for you, to your persona, what works in your own individual teaching context. One of the very first classes I taught was a large lecture, U.S. history, as an adjunct. I was 30 years old and little teaching experience, and I was 8 months pregnant. Those were all factors that I should have been aware might change my teaching practices and my interactions with students. But I just didn't have that sense of what can I adapt? What do I need to be aware of? What kind of assumptions, biases? So, the section on inequity, 2 of the strategies are for our learners, we want to maximize ways that we can plan for learner variability, but we also have to plan for learner biases and stereotypes.
So the learner variability is so important. And I love that we are talking about a recipe, because it isn't like recipes should never exist then, because
Right.
because of
That's
these factors that you brought in.
That's right.
And you have gifted us with some wonderful recipes. And throughout the work here, you use the acronym STIR. And so I'll just tell the listeners: STOP for S, think for T, identify for the letter I, and repair. Let's begin with stop, because stop can look so different for so many. I kept thinking about how much stop has helped me. So whether it's Mike Caulfield's SIFT model, which for listeners who may not be familiar with it, begins with this idea of stopping before we repost something that turns out to not be accurate, that we have this visceral reaction to. And then I used to, eons ago, which just still cracks me up that I did this, but I was responsible for teaching consultative salespeople, which I never would have told you ever would have been part of my career. And it's kind of surprising to me now, but there's so much in consultative sales, really, really good stuff that's problem solving and deep listening. And so I brought a set of tools that I didn't realize, but when I'll give you a quick example, and then of course I want to hear about more about STIR, but there's this classic framework in this book, and I'll put a link in case anybody's interested. It's literally the favorite book I've ever read about sales, and I didn't have a lot of favorites, so it's not a genre that I found myself really wanting to read voraciously, but it's really good. But he talks about your meeting with someone. And you could even picture meeting with a student, or maybe you're on a job interview and the person that you're speaking with looks at their watch. And that can be, oh my gosh, did I just say something wrong? Or is that student bored? How dare them come to my office and have the audacity of being bored or whatever? And so we have to stop ourselves. And I remember this framework so well. Okay, stop. If I'm starting to feel this, any kind of emotions coming up, okay, stop. And then you state what happened. I noticed that you just looked at your watch. Is there somewhere you need to be or something? And then you stop, you state what happened, and then you pass it to them. And they called it the red light. So the red light, you stop when you're experiencing this yellow light thing. And then, this yellow light, I don't know how to interpret this. So I'm going to stop, and then I'm going to state what I just noticed behaviorally. I noticed this thing happened, and then pass it to them to let them turn it green or red, because maybe they really are bored, or maybe they really do have somewhere to be, or maybe they had an itch on their wrist, or they were just curious what time it was. So
that's a good one. That's really good.
Throughout this book, you give us so many of these scripts, but you allow us to think about using them on our own unique context, which is just so helpful.
Yeah, so I mean, I have to start by saying I understand there's probably already too many acronyms in the world. Like, and we scholars of teaching and learning, we do have a weakness for a catchy acronym. It was so stir. It's mostly just a way to frame just what you said to help the readers figure out what's going to work for them and their context. And I agree that that first one is probably the most important, the stop one. This and I don't think we're well trained as smarty pants scholars to stop and ponder, which is weird hearing myself say it, because that, stopping and pondering is actually what we do in our work. But for teaching and interacting around our content, we're really most of us as scholars are really well trained to be like snappy and reply immediately and show off how smart we are right away. So stopping, and then of course all that the unhelpful emotional, but not completely natural emotional responses that can come flooding in, depending on the interaction. And what sets me off may very well not be what sets you off. Although I wasn't in class yesterday. Did I miss anything? Seems to be a universal for educators. So this idea of having a script, that's one repair strategy. I do offer some repair strategies. And it's definitely not about having a long memorized speech that you have to use one single way every single time. It's definitely not about you got to deliver content this way with a long speech. But this is going to be one of my recommendations. And I was really influenced by Shabella Pittman's work around microaggressions and classroom incivility, and the power of having prepared a short couple sentences that can come out of your mouth more proactively and not reactively, and tailored to what works for you or your persona, and particularly for situations that are going to be really, really difficult. So one example is, unfortunately, that many of us have experienced, and maybe more so in the past few years, when a really terrible event happens, either like locally, nationally, at another university. What are you going to say in class the next day? Now, let's be clear, like if you are just so skilled that you can orate at the drop of a hat, no matter how stressed you are or how out of their minds students are at the moment, or how just like miserable it is, then sure, you don't need to think about what you might say beforehand, because the words are just going to come magically to you and everyone's going to feel great after you talk. But I mean, if that's you, like, congratulations, I guess. But most of us will stumble and fumble, especially, I mean, actually, in either case, if the class is really not connected to this event at all, your content doesn't touch on it, or if your content is really relevant, like, what are you going to say? And the research shows that pretending it didn't happen doesn't work. Students are like, what's going on? Did they not know about this thing? But also, it doesn't work to like go down the rabbit hole into it, especially if you're uncomfortable about it. You don't know how to. So preparing a few sentences ahead of time, maybe just acknowledging that it happened and that there's some resources on campus, and you'd be happy to stay after class and be a listening ear if someone just wants to process a little bit, something like that. So feeling more able and ready, because then, as we all know, like within minutes, something else unexpected will happen and you'll have to respond. But knowing ahead of time some predictable ones, like that one, did I miss anything? Like having at least not defaulting to the snarkiest, most sarcastic response, which is not helpful when you're talking with a student. No, so having that couple sentences in mind has helped me get the conversation started in a more productive and proactive way, not reactive.
I found myself you would laugh if you saw my digital copy because it's practically the entire thing is highlighted. I'm like, you're defeating the purpose of your digital highlighter if you highlight the entire book. But I did find myself wanting to go back to practice things because not only do our intersectional identities and of course unique contexts affect this, but also the type of course that we're teaching. I mean that both in terms of the literal type of course, it might be disciplinary or is it, how does it gear itself? But also for me, teaching asynchronous classes, boy, stopping is not a problem because because I have all the time in the world. The goal there would be maybe don't stop so long that you let this live rent free in your head, for that long, that sort of thing. And then also I found it interesting when you were talking about that. Did I miss anything? I have this flash. So this is now the 20th year that I'm teaching in a higher education context. So there's things like, did I miss anything? I have no reaction to that other than like answer their question. I don't like that's long since, gotten, but I was watching a video of Tressie McMillan Cottom and I might, I don't know if I bookmarked it or not. She does these Instagram lives. And so they kind of come and go. I don't always remember to bookmark it, but there was a phrase that I really used to be pretty prickly for me early in my career. Someone would come and maybe ask about changing a grade or turning in something late. And I had very different feelings about these things than I do today, but they would say, it doesn't hurt to ask. And in my mind, I would find that offensive. Like, well, of course it does. How dare you ask me? And she literally had someone ask her if she would, I don't know if it was guest speak in a class or this woman had written an essay and would she come to her class that she's taking? I don't remember, but whatever it was a wild, audacious ask. And Tressie literally says, it doesn't hurt to ask. And I did it. Like because this young woman asked, I thought, oh my goodness, what a different framing for it doesn't hurt to ask. I had all these flashes of, what would the world look like if more of us were given permission and encouraged to ask with boldness for things that, I just thought like, wow, so we can that stop. There's, like you said, there's so much that can happen in that stop, both in the moment that is so beautiful and beneficial, but also over the span of many years to be thinking and rethinking about all the different ways that these things might be able to be interpreted in our responses. And I just really want to thank you for these scripts that you gave, as I found so many of them. I thought, oh gosh, that is, so similar to what I would want to say. And, that one really fits with something I could see myself saying, but it doesn't work unless you actually practice. You don't read through a book like this and then walk out and just go, I know, I'm cured. I'm a superhero teacher again, Jessamyn. I've done it,
Yeah. And I used to feel like a dork, like practicing some of these. And some of these, like it's easy. I have some email ones that I can just type, without hardly even thinking about it, just to start the conversation. Practicing, you do feel like a dork until you actually need it. And I was just thinking that example is an interesting one. Doesn't hurt to ask. And the way that, again, our intersectional identities and teaching context would shape what kind of navigating we would have to do of that particular request. Certain people with a certain embodied identities will get certain kinds of requests more and more adamantly and with less civility than others. So responding to that in a positive way, like being able to more proactively have your response, knowing that it's coming, and plan for whatever you might need to do to maintain your own pedagogical wellness in that context. Another one that came to my mind when you were talking was, this is also one of my repair strategies, is apologizing. Now, not everybody teaching college has the same exact kinds of freedom or ability to apologize when they do something wrong. But for me, it popped into my head when you were talking about, like, it doesn't even faze me anymore. Because that is one, when I started, it was so hard for me, even like a minor mistake, because I felt like I was giving up some of my power, I was showing weakness. And now I just have practiced it enough and done enough. And to be clear, I have enough privilege and employment security to do so. But it was so freeing, because now when I mess up, and I mess up because, again, human beings mess up, I can just say, wow, I messed that up. I apologize. I'm sorry about that. And I'll do blah, blah, blah to fix it. And it's not magic, but sometimes it feels almost magical, the way it just like, okay, so now we can just move on. We can just keep going now. And in general, again, this isn't true for everybody. It was not true for every situation. But in general, I have found that students recognize and respond to that. And then I can see them doing it too, which can be really helpful.
Yeah, I remember about that part of the book also thinking that particularly, I mean, you mentioned a number of different examples that may require or invite apologies. I think maybe my temptation could have sometimes been to prolong the apology. And yes. I thought when he said that, I thought that comes from wisdom right there. This does not need to be dissertation length apology, even if it is something that you consider egregious. I mean, we are going to make pretty egregious mistakes. I mean, if we're actually taking the kinds of risks that may foster incredible transformation. But that sort of processing and disclosure would not be the best place to be doing that. That's that's a trusted friend outside that context.
The classic example is with names. Learning and using students' names. It's really hard. Shout out to Michelle Miller's short guidebook on learning and using students' names. It's very difficult. One of the reasons it's so difficult is because the opportunities for looking like a complete ass are pretty endless. So that's why people avoid it. Not just educators, but students. People are nervous about learning and using each other's names, because when you get it wrong, it's embarrassing. And it can be very tempting to start in on a long explanation or justification for why you messed up someone's name. That's not helpful. It's not on them to absolve you of the difficulty of learning names. So saying, wow, I really messed up your names. I'm sorry about that. We're working on learning and using each other's names, and I'll keep working on it too.
And then you can vent to your friend later on that afternoon when you go for a little walk and talk together and say, then you can express all the embarrassment and how difficult it is. Yes. Well, this is the time in the show where we each get to share our recommendations, and I have two of them. They are both related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The first is from one of my just favorite satirical sites, McSweeney's. The article is entitled, "Our University is Replacing DEI with Vibes and Vaguely Diverse Stock Photos" by Carla M. Lopez. And it is just an absolute delight for the absolute absurdity of where we, at least here in the United States, are finding ourselves. And speaking of privilege, I feel privileged and honored and grateful for the fact that this podcast is done as an independent thing and has been for more than a decade now, such that I can recommend articles like this and not have to worry about what that might look like for others who may not have the same sort of privilege, et cetera. That felt really good just to, be able to share these things freely. And my goodness gracious, do we ever sometimes just need to laugh? Because I'm not saying we need to laugh all the time, but some of the time we need to laugh. So the other one is also related to that same topic. And speaking of comedy, it is with Jon Stewart, of course, a famous comedian in his own right. Having said that, though, this is actually not a particularly funny interview. It's mostly serious. In fact, it may even be all serious from my memory. And it is called DEI, ? You're Fired, with Heather McGhee. And Heather McGhee goes and shares a lot of definitions of things. And it's just a very good, pragmatic look at some of the issues that so many countries around the world are facing today. I would recommend both of these, the first one for a laugh and the second one for a little bit of a deeper look from an expert that I found to be quite enjoyable. And Jessamyn, I'm going to pass it over to you for whatever you'd like to recommend.
Okay, so the first is an article that was published in The Scholarly Teacher by Shavella Pittman. It's called 10 in-the-moment responses for addressing micro and macroaggressions in the classroom. The second is a book by David Yeager called 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People. The third is another book about teaching must read. Many of your readers will have already seen this, but I want to emphasize again, Critical Teaching Behaviors, Defining, Documenting, and Discussing Good Teaching by Claudia Happel and Lauren Barbeau. Then, I should have said my list is a mix of scholarship of teaching and learning stuff and also just products for fun consumption. So if you have seen me in person wondering how I got these absolutely gorgeous curls on my head, it's the Dippity Doo Girls with Curls Curl Boosting Mousse. I highly recommend it. If you are looking for a perpetual calendar, the one I have here in the Teaching and Learning Center at Syracuse is the MoMA. One from MoMA is a sliding perpetual calendar. It is super fun. For people in dry climates or have suffered through the winter, Mrs. Meyer's Clean Day hand soap is the only soap that doesn't dry out my hands too much. The Teaching and Learning Together in Higher Education journal is, I mentioned, my colleague Ebony Graham and our Students as Partners emphasis. Teaching and Learning Together in Higher Education is one of the most important journals publishing research on students as partners, pedagogical partnerships. Of course, a shout out T for Teaching, the podcast, always good, with John Kane and Rebecca Mushter. Another book, again, many people will have seen, but just want to shout out to Elizabeth Norrell, who's one of the early readers of SNAFU Edu, gave me so much great feedback. And her book, The Present Professor, Authenticity and Transformational Teaching, is a must read. I also just wanted to shout out in New York, State of New York, if you are close to the Thrifty Shopper thrift store, that is one of the best thrift store chains I've ever shopped in. And finally, one entertainment recommendation, the series, there was only 2 seasons of it, but it was perfection. It's streaming on Peacock. It's called We Are Lady Parts. And I have the, I have the,
I love it already, and I don't even know what it is.
Season 1 trailer on YouTube.
Oh, that sounds like so much fun.
Yes, it's about 4 Muslim women who form a punk rock band.
Oh my gosh. So fun. Oh gosh, so we're going to give our Sierra Priest, our podcast production support person. She's going to have to do some heavy lifting here, but I think it's going to be worth it to all of us.
Oh no, I have the links. I will.
Oh no, I just mean she makes beautiful graphics for them.
Oh,
it's so much fun. She will be paid for her work, and she also will enjoy it too. But yes, she'll have a little more than usual. But she is a teacher, and I suspect that this hand soap, for how much teachers need to wash our hands, she's probably going to really appreciate that. I'm so curious what a sliding perpetual calendar is. I know what a perpetual calendar is, but I don't know what a sliding one is.
Well, it's beautifully designed because it's from the MoMA, from Museum of Modern Art, New York City, and you'll just have to click on the link.
I'm definitely going to look forward to clicking. I'm going to look forward to clicking on all of these links. And speaking of clicking on links, of course, people need to go find SNAFU Edu, Teaching and Learning When Things Go Wrong in the College Classroom. I will have a link in the show notes, and find it in your library, find it in an independent bookstore, find it, and it's going to be something that will be a gift that you can just keep picking up and returning to for abundant treasures. Yeah, so glad for today's conversation and looking forward to the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks once again to Jessamyn Neuhaus for joining me on today's episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. Today's episode was produced by me, Bonnie Stachowiak. It was edited by the ever-talented Andrew Kroger. Podcast production support was provided by the amazing Sierra Priest. Thank you so much for listening. And if you've not yet signed up for the weekly update, you're missing out on not having to remember to go to the show notes to get all those good links. They can be emailed directly to you. And also you'll receive some other resources that don't show up in the show notes. So head over to teachinginhighered.com/subscribe. You can start receiving those weekly updates right away. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Teaching in Higher Ed.